Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Buyer Intelligence Group webinar, which will look at cloud adoption, key actions, decisions, and considerations. I'm Vicki Jenkins, and today's presenter is David McIntire, NelsonHall's IT Services Research Director. We'd like this session to be interactive, so while everyone will be on mute during the main presentation, please do ask questions by entering them in the questions panel on your screen as they come to mind, and at the end of the session we will have a brief Q&A. And moving to the next slide, I have a few things to share with you before I hand things over to David. Let me quickly recap the benefits of being a member of the Buyer Intelligence Group, looking specifically at the benefits of the gold level membership. All group members benefit from being part of a community of sourcing peers and from a level of free access to NelsonHall's neat vendor evaluations, which help you get started with your sourcing initiatives. However, to take your sourcing projects to the next stage, sourcing decision makers need a lot more. When it comes to screening markets and vendors against your very own specific business requirements, this can be a tricky process, and it may be that you don't have the time to engage with vendors directly or feel that you would rather be protected from some of the overt vendor sales techniques. If that's the case, you can become a gold member, and NelsonHall will carry out the detailed investigation and screening work for you. We will take your specific brief and find all the answers you need to be able to proceed without risk to the stage of engaging with the market, including issuing RFPs to shortlisted vendors. We will investigate the exact nature and maturity of the supply market you are interested in, identify the service delivery models available and which ones are most suitable for your requirements, and tell you which other organizations in a similar situation to you have already outsourced in your target market and what outcomes have been realized, such as levels of cost savings and process quality improvements. And on this slide, you can see a table showing the full list of features and benefits of gold level membership. A recent example of work we conducted for a gold level member in the energy and utilities sector in the area of tax outsourcing, and we have done similar investigations on behalf of clients across a variety of different business process areas and across a variety of industry sectors. So that's just a quick view of what you can get from working with NelsonHall as a gold member of the Buyer Intelligence Group, and we are happy to discuss this further with individual members at any time. Now, let me hand things over to David for the main presentation.
Thank you, Vicki. And hello, everyone. This is David McIntire. As Vicki mentioned, I am an IT Services Research Director with NelsonHall. I've been with the firm about a year and a half, which I joined after spending the last 16 years prior to that with a leading IT services firm. So much of the information I'm going to be presenting today is the result of a research project we undertook about a year ago, published late last summer, in which we reviewed the IT service vendors' cloud infrastructure migration and management capabilities. And while cloud's a ubiquitous term today and it's frequently talked about, when we look at cloud services for large enterprises, it's still a relatively immature area. Many organizations are in a trial phase, standing up non-production environments, implementing SaaS solutions such as Office 365 or Salesforce, but not a lot of organizations have really taken the holistic enterprise look at how they can adopt cloud end-to-end through an enterprise. And to do that, enterprise cloud adoption should be undertaken in a structured, phased approach. Based on addressing an individual's organization's different objectives, restraints, concerns, risk tolerance, etc. And that phased approach has 4 key steps that we're going to talk through today. The first one is developing a cloud strategy, which is really kind of deciding why you want to leverage the cloud and how you want to go about leveraging the cloud. Then from that overall strategy to get a little more granular, you look at assessing the individual workloads that might be migrating to a cloud and developing the migration plan itself. And this allows you to understand where you are currently, find the right approach to leveraging the cloud, and then developing a plan to implement that. Next is the actual execution of that plan, so actually migrating workloads and standing up cloud ecosystems. And then finally, once the cloud ecosystem is up and migration is complete, the work doesn't end, then you need to actually manage that cloud ecosystem going forward. So we're going to look at each of these steps in a little more detail. So for developing an overall enterprise cloud strategy needs to answer a number of basic questions. The first one is, what value do we want to achieve through cloud adoption? There's a number of reasons for adopting a cloud ecosystem, whether it's broad digital transformation, at a strategic level, some simple infrastructure cost reduction, or process optimization. So it's really understanding what is that overall goal that the organization seeks through cloud. Second is how much change and how quickly and what type of change can an organization handle. Given the answer to the first question is broad digital transformation obviously drives significantly more change to an organization than potentially infrastructure cost reduction. So understanding the give and take between those two. How do we want to use the cloud? Similarly, from one extreme of standing up some temporary non-production environments to save some infrastructure costs, to all the way to the other extreme of full end-to-end digital transformation and potentially getting out of the infrastructure business altogether, so no longer owning any servers or data centers. Next question would be, what types of cloud environments are we comfortable in? There's a lot of range of potential cloud environments, from the wholly public cloud such as AWS to more private cloud. So given our data security concerns, what is the right answer for this organization? And then the final question is, given all these other questions, is this something we as an organization can handle on our own, or is this something we're looking for some help with? Depending on the level of change, the path chosen, there may be some skills and capabilities necessary that the organization doesn't possess, so it's looking outside to another supporting organization to help. So as you can see on the slide, as part of a strategy, there are two key components to think about, the workload strategy and the cloud environment strategy. So the first part of the cloud strategy is a workload strategy, and this begins to answer the question of how do we want to leverage the cloud. This is in part driven by what value the organization wants to achieve, and in parallel, what is the business case for this cloud adoption. So there's, as I've said, there's multiple overall approaches: whole-scale transformation, some simple operating cost reduction, or just looking at something like disaster recovery as an area where we can, leverage incremental capacity. When thinking about the workload strategy, some key considerations. The first is around capacity requirements. So when we look at the workloads that we're thinking about moving to the cloud, how much does that capacity demand fluctuate? Because this, in a lot of times, can help drive how much value there is in the cloud migration. If a system basically runs all day, every day, and churns out the same amount of transactions and it requires the same amount of capacity, there may not be a lot of value in a migration to a cloud. It's the ones that have a high fluctuation, whether it's a retail system around the holidays or maybe a financial system that has to process end of month and end of quarter statements, where there's high spikes in demand over a period. That is where cloud really provides the greatest value. Second one is the operating cost of the existing systems. If there's minimal operating cost today, there may not be a lot of value in the effort, cost, and risk of migrating to the cloud, as there's little value to be achieved by reducing that operating cost. And finally, the risk appetite of the organization. What level of change, and how much of that change are we comfortable handling as organization? So if we look at workload strategies themselves, there's three non-mutually exclusive, but kind of three buckets you could potentially look at, and obviously there's a lot of gray areas in between these. The first one would be looking at moving non-production environments. So this achieves some level of cost reduction for non-production, such as development and test environments. And the value here is that development test environments are often just temporary environments and therefore only need to be stood up and can be stood down for periods of time, and they don't need to be running 24 hours a day typically. So there's opportunities to save money on the use of that capacity in the periods when those aren't needed. But obviously its core organizational impact is less, as it's a non-production. The next one would be looking at non-critical applications. So these may be back-end systems that aren't core to the business function that can be to move to a cloud to save on costing, whether it's operating costs from an infrastructure and application standpoint. And finally would be looking at the entire enterprise and considering any and all applications, regardless of business criticality, for the potential move to the cloud. Obviously, this has both the greatest value, as there's an opportunity across the whole application landscape to reduce costs and drive transformation, but at the same time, it increases the risk and effort. The second part of the strategy is in choosing the cloud environment approach, and this is primarily driven by a cost versus control decision. Obviously, the first is a public cloud environment that we're all familiar with, the AWSs and the Azures of the world. This is typically the cheapest option and provides the most flexibility. It's as simple as logging onto a website and procuring a new environment with a credit card at the base. But security and data concerns have broadly been the greatest constraint on broad enterprise adoption for established organizations. Typically what we're seeing today is large organizations are only looking at either non-production or non-critical applications going into public clouds. There is one kind of area where that differs, and that is potentially in public-facing digital properties, thinking of like an e-commerce website, given that they can have potentially high capacity fluctuations as well as have the potential for needing to interact with customers all around the globe. Having a broad public cloud network to support that, it does make sense. Second option is private cloud, so hosted virtual machines, either on-premises themselves or at a vendor hosted. Given that this is more of a private cloud and there's greater constraints around it, this does reduce the security concerns, but obviously at a slightly higher cost than just pure public. It does provide that variable capacity uptake, and given that it's got higher security and provides that variable capacity, they are seeing greater adoption of newer systems. For example, something like migrating from a legacy SAP system to SAP HANA is a candidate for then migrating also to the private cloud. And then the third and most common option when looking at large enterprises, looking at large-scale cloud adoption, is the hybrid model of public and private clouds. And this can include implementing SaaS solutions as well as maybe the non-production environments in public and then some of the enterprise core applications in private. So it provides essentially the case-by-case basis of what makes most sense per workload. And when you're looking at making these decisions, the key considerations, similar to what we've seen regularly, the first one is regulatory limitations. Does your organization have limitations regulatory-wise as far as where data can sit? Eurozone, I know there's quite a fit of data organizations. Government contracting can have data limitations. So understanding what limitations you have can help drive this decision. Similarly, security. So from an internal security policy perspective and comfort perspective, where do we think it makes sense for the data from a specific workload to sit? I think one of the key ones that we'll touch on throughout this is around integration. And when you're looking at a wholesale enterprise adoption of the cloud, The more nodes you add to a cloud and in a hybrid environment, the more complex it becomes and the more important integration becomes between those different systems. They need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to transfer data. If you're talking about disparate environments and disparate locations, you're adding complexity and you're potentially adding latency as information is passed back and forth. So thinking through how that integration will work based on where workloads sit is a key component. Location, and this is really actually literally comes down to the location of that cloud region where you are hosting. If all of your people are located one place and your workloads are sitting on the other side of the world, obviously that builds in quite a bit of latency and performance challenges if you have to reach out to that cloud every time you need to interact with that workload. And then finally, coming back to culture, company culture, how risk averse, how open to change adoption are you as an organization, going back to that cost versus control decision. Okay. So after developing the strategy, the next step would be to start the detailed planning. And this begins with assessing workloads and then developing the migration plan. The migration plan turns the strategic direction into action and is made up of two components, the migration approach and the migrational plan itself. So developing a migration approach identifies which workloads are migrating to the cloud and how. This is often done after an assessment is completed, which enables an organization to really understand the current application landscape. Application landscapes, especially in large organizations, tend to evolve over time as applications are enhanced, new applications are added, and organizations essentially lose sight of the full scale and complexity of their application landscape. And then, so by assessing the application and developing an approach for each of those workloads, then you can then develop the migration plan, which is more of the project plan that identifies the activities and timelines and owners to complete the migration itself. So as far as a migration approach, when that assessment occurs, you need to consider developing that approach considers the following. First is the current application landscape, and this is driven out of that assessment itself. And the assessment typically will result in understanding what languages underpin the various application, how big, how many lines of code an individual workload it represents, what the integrations are, what applications or workloads talk to each other, the relative complexity of each workload, the level of customization that's been applied. Is it a off-the-shelf product or has it been extremely customized, and what the current support needs are for it. Assessments are typically done with a combination of both manual processes, such as interviewing application owners to understand those support needs and understand what customization is implied, as well as automated assessments where you can literally leverage tools that crawl through the code and can read and understand what the code is and the level of complexity and the language and the size of that code. So the result of that application assessment helps to identify how best to migrate to the cloud. There are two primary approaches to migrating workloads. The first one would be replacing that workload. And this is sunsetting the application as it exists today and replacing it with a wholly new cloud native application. This, as we'll dig into, it can be either a SaaS product, so a product that's basically off the shelf, or it can actually be a cloud native developed application. In particular, around SaaS, the key attributes looking for an application would be something that's low complexity and low customization, has relatively simple data requirements, including both the type of data and the volume of data that it transacts with, in a level of integration, and then the impact on the change management and business processes. You can replace, even if a particular workload does not score well on the the things I was just discussing, but you need to recognize that there's going to be a larger process change or change management effort that's required to go with that. And then the second option for migrating is what I'm calling replatforming and refactoring, and that's taking the existing code base today, updating and modernizing it, and making it ready and optimized to work on the cloud itself. And these are typically only used on customized or very complex core applications, given the larger effort required. And then obviously the third choice is to not migrate at all. So if a workload should remain on premises and not be migrated to the cloud at all, it can be removed from the overall migration plan. These are typically core applications, maybe specifically much older applications where it's just too complex and the business case wouldn't be valuable. So then once you have an idea of what you are migrating, what each workload is being migrated and the approach, the migration plan lays out the timing, activities, and owners of that migration effort. So key considerations to think about when you're starting to lay out a migration plan is, what is the complexity of the migration effort for an individual workload? Are you developing a new application? Are you implementing a SaaS? Are you replacing and so actually writing the code? How will the data be migrated and how much cleanup is required? What is the impact of on integration, including potential for interim integration needs if different workloads that interact closely are transformed on different schedules? And what is the criticality of that workload? Oops. So a couple different avenues or consideration ways to think about the migration planning, ways of bundling waves of workloads to migrate. First one would be around functional families. So this is looking at applications that are closely coupled, that operate closely together, and it's thinking about them and considering them as a group. This helps to reduce potentially the data and integration needs, especially as far as any interim integration. Secondarily is the business case itself. Potentially, given the level of effort for a cloud adoption, sometimes from a funding perspective, certain high-cost applications may need to be migrated first to enable funding to then pay for the continuation of the cloud adoption effort. Finally, or next is complexity, and this is looking at, do we want to look at potentially low complexity workloads that may be a quicker migration effort to then these act as a quick win to help prove to the organization as a proof of concept that there's value in this and really help bring the organization along on the full cloud adoption effort. And then finally, criticality. And this can have two ways, either moving the easier, the less critical applications first, which helps essentially, again, proof of concept and de-risk the early as everyone's kind of learning through this process, or alternatively move the most critical first if there's greater business case and value to be realized by doing that. So from executing a migration, as we've talked about, there's really three actual components to take those plans we've developed and actually execute it. There's the activity of actually replacing the existing workloads with new cloud-native applications. There's replatforming and refactoring, where we're actually modifying the existing code to work more optimized in the cloud. And then there's the actual activity of procuring and standing up cloud environments where these are going to reside. So from, as we've touched on, if I'm replacing existing workloads with new cloud native, what is the approach? And there's two areas to approach. The first is SaaS solutions, off-the-shelf digital applications, things like Salesforce, which people are familiar with, that are hosted in the vendor's own cloud. So these are workloads that are migrated that are typically either low complexity or low customizations, or the organization must account for the level of business process change required to adopt the SaaS processes in the SaaS solution. Alternatively, you can look at SaaS for new functionality that maybe not be in existence today, and therefore there's not as much of a change effort because this is a new process as opposed to having to relearn a process that's already been ingrained internally. A lot of the early SaaS adoptions have been potentially kind of non-business critical or back office applications. As people can use these SaaS solutions, they aren't concerned about losing the customization. It's not a core business function, so they're more willing to adopt the basic SaaS processes. The core migration activities, rather than major development effort, consist primarily of configuring the SaaS solution, understanding and developing the integration for the SaaS solution to work with the other components of the ecosystem, and then migrating data. The second component, or the second alternative for replacing, is around building a cloud-native application itself. So this is actually developing a custom application specifically customized and optimized to work in the cloud. Typically, these are built in PaaS, platform as a service type environments, a cloud-based development environment, such as IBM Bluemix is an example, that allows the custom application to be developed wholly in the cloud and to be ready and optimized for use in the cloud. So considerations when you're thinking about what the replacement approach is going to mean. Obviously, customizations are a key understanding. How customized are those current workloads? And what is the organization's appetite for changing? And this is why it has driven the SaaS adoption for some of the back office and non-business core, as it's an opportunity to more optimize these processes for something that's not, revenue impacting. Integration, what other systems does this new application need to integrate with? When you're talking about a SaaS, it's a incremental node, for lack of a better word, on your ecosystem. So where are the other systems it's going to be transacting or pulling data from, and how do they interact back and forth? And then data, again, the security and regulatory requirements of the underlying data. And not just the security and regulatory with Shufton, but also I think one aspect of data that may be sometimes under-considered is the volumes. If you're looking at, as I said, if you're looking at a SaaS application that's sitting on its own node in a cloud ecosystem and it needs to consume significantly large volumes of data, that's an extra pass essentially across the network that's required. And is it capable of doing that? And are there going to be performance issues if it needs to be real-time data transfers? And can the SaaS handle that transaction or that level of volume of transactional data? So when deciding not to replace, instead either replatform or refactor an existing workload, the key need is to understand what is the level of change required for this application to operate successfully in a cloud environment. And this should in part result from the assessment that was done previously. As we've talked about, one of the key aspects of how a workload will work in the cloud would be its technical currency of the present solution. Newer, more modern applications may be migrated to the cloud with minimal changes, a lift and shift type approach, while looking at older applications that may be in more dated language or sit on a more dated infrastructure will require greater modification. Migrating more complex and older applications historically have struggled to achieve business case given the effort and risk, but this potentially could be changing as cloud costs come down and migration offerings improve. So this comes to the idea of when you're looking at these older applications, this may be the draw between is the refactoring effort worth it versus leaving it on premise and just operating, as there may not be a lot of incremental value in migrating to a cloud given the level of risk and impact on the organization. And then again, coming back to, as we've touched on several times, integration when thinking about these applications. Again, how is it interacting with other workloads? Where are those workloads going to sit in the new environment? And how do we transfer that data back and forth? So then the final step of the migration itself is the provisioning of the cloud. And you look at alternatively, the individual environments needs stood up, whether it's an individual public environment, whether it's multiple public environments, private environments, and then how they all get tied together into a core cloud ecosystem. One can look at taking a stepwise approach. So if ultimately an organization would like to get to a public cloud environment but isn't comfortable going from on-premise dedicated hardware all the way to the public cloud, you can look at migrating to a private cloud, and then once you're comfortable with how the system's operating and the security, you can then migrate it further to private. Obviously there's some incremental cost, but that second step is significantly less. The Microsoft Azure Stack offering you may be familiar with is specifically designed for this approach, where essentially the public and private environments mirror each other, and therefore by making a workload ready for the public environment, or excuse me, for the private environment, a later migration to the public environment is significantly easier. And then, as we've touched on, the key considerations when deciding which environment for an individual workload or how you're migrating to that workload is the security. Where can I store this data securely, meeting my internal and regulatory requirements? Location is a key one. How close is this cloud environment? And you can see that the criticality of location by how frequently you hear about cloud hosting providers launching new regions and new offerings. I think AWS launches or announces new regions on basically every single quarter, and IBM is launching, from a more of a private view, IBM is launching new cloud data centers regularly. I think they're up to roughly 50 public/private data centers around the globe today, with AWS and Azure having even more from a private or public perspective. Again, touching on the data, are there limitations on where data can be stored, public versus private? Again, this may be government contracting, Eurozone implications, things like that. The integration between the various sites. So if one workload is sitting on one public environment and another workload sitting on a different private environment, how are they interacting, and where does that integration layer sit? Is the integration layer becoming another cloud environment? Is it becoming hosted internally? How does that all tie together? And then the key one, which we'll go into, is the management of this ecosystem. Who's managing this, and how are they managing this environment? Especially when you're looking at a hybrid ecosystem. And this comes down to a level of governance, which we'll touch on now. So the last step, as we talked on, once we've actually stood up workloads across that cloud ecosystem, is managing the cloud ecosystem. And there's multiple levels within this ongoing management. The first one is around ongoing provisioning and orchestration across workloads. So part of prior to standing up, we need to define what is going to be provisioned, how provisioning is going to work going forward, who has the rights and responsibilities for doing that, and then within a cloud ecosystem, the orchestration across environments. If your e-commerce system is sitting in private today, but you want to have kind of a fail-safe option for when capacity spikes in the public, how do you trigger that orchestration to roll over into that public cloud environment? The provisioning, thinking about if going forward we need to stand up a new development environment, who has the rights to stand up that environment and pay for it, et cetera, to limit the idea of shadow IT popping up all over the place without prior approvals. ITSM from an IT service management, especially in a hybrid environment, who is managing and troubleshooting problems and incidents across the entire ecosystem. If you've got a SaaS environment, you've got some applications sitting in the public cloud and sitting in a private cloud, if there's a transaction going between two of those environments and that transaction fails, who owns the responsibility for going in and resolving where that issue lies? And finally, governance. As we touched on, one of the major concerns about cloud that's limited a lot of its public cloud growth today is the idea of shadow IT, that anyone in an organization can go out, stand up their own environment and run with it. So the level of governance helps define who has the rights to stand up new environments, how are we orchestrating across them. So we need clear rules and processing for managing and adding to the cloud ecosystem. So this is the core process from a cloud adoption standpoint, and kind of taking a slight shift, going back to one of the original questions of, is this something my organization can do on its own, or is it something we need help with? If you are looking at reaching out to an outside vendor for support, there's a couple considerations to think through on helping identify the right vendor for supporting you. The first one is the vendor-client relationship. Vendors frequently talk about their new offerings, their new capabilities, their new tools and offerings, but our research has repeatedly shown when it comes to picking a vendor, the number one reason clients select vendors is their relationship and partnering. This isn't an overnight transaction. It's not a one-time transaction. This is going to be a journey. It's going to require a level of relationship and partnering for a period of time. And so having a vendor that you trust and can rely on is a key component of it. The second consideration is what I call phase needs, and this really goes to understanding within that journey we just talked through, where are your organization's limitations? Where do you have strengths, and where are the areas you feel like you need the most help? Is it early on as far as helping to do that assessment and developing that migration plan? Is it later managing that cloud ecosystem? Vendors primarily offer full lifecycle services, but have varying levels of strengths, often depending on where their heritage was. A company with a consulting heritage, may be stronger in the upfront piece, as well. A company with more of an infrastructure heritage may be stronger in the back-end management and private cloud hosting services. One of the things we'll touch on in a minute is around automation and the level of automation employed by vendors. This is a key focus area for vendors themselves. So understanding, similar to the phase needs, understanding where you could most leverage automation, or where the automation is most highly needed, can help shape which vendors, because not all vendors invest in all automation across the lifecycle similarly. And then finally, experience. As we've talked about, this is still a relatively immature area. So from when you're looking at a full lifecycle enterprise cloud adoption, their vendors and clients may both be early in this phase. So understanding what experience vendors have as far as helping clients migrate large-scale enterprises in similar either industries, or if you're looking in certain business processes themselves, understanding where they've worked in these areas before is a critical understanding. So just touching on automation very briefly, as I said, automation is really a core area where where vendors are investing heavily today to support the cloud adoption process. But they're investing in different areas and have different levels of maturity in their automation offerings. So when you look across the three kind of key areas for automation, There's essentially core automation that pretty much all vendors can provide, and then there's the more leading edge automation that people are starting to see. So in assessment and planning, nearly all vendors will employ an application discovery tool, such as those offered by App Dynamics, for example, that go through and are able to assess and crawl through the code and assess what the application looks like. Leading edge solutions, or solutions that are more cutting edge today, have automation that not only can assess that application, but after some defined business rules can help actually recommend a disposition application by application, and then take that disposition and actually start to lay out a migration plan. So it actually can cover all the way from assessing all the way through developing that migration plan. And for the migration itself, the core automation is the actual migration of the code itself. So if we're migrating, if we've replatformed a workload and we're migrating it into a cloud environment, the actual activity of taking that code base and migrating it to a new environment is automated. When you're looking at more leading edge, it may be taking that older, may be able to analyze that older code and actually make automated adjustments to that code itself to simplify and shorten the development effort to refactor an application. So there's actually multiple steps there. And then cloud management and hosting, brokerage, provisioning, orchestration, and consumption tracking of cloud environments is a early automation where nearly all vendor cloud management platforms provide some level of automation. When you're looking at the leading edge, it maintains these still same functions, but it starts to apply machine learning capabilities across all these activities, including the incorporation of ITSM, incident resolution. So the automation is maybe predicting when we're going to need to scale up a new environment. It's learning over time where common failures are occurring between different applications, and it's actually able to resolve those without human interaction. Sorry, slide's not forwarding. For some reason, my slides are no longer forwarding. Vic, you're up there. Okay. So just one last slide talking about vendors. As we said, cloud adoption is a key activity today, and it's expected to be growth going forward. While cloud adoption has been relatively conservative to date, primarily non-production and non-critical workloads, several surveys have shown that upwards of 65 to 70% of organizations are viewing cloud as a key focus area over the next year or two. Given that, IT services vendors have been positioning themselves to ensure that they have the capabilities necessary to support their client base. And they've done this through two avenues, either adding tools to expand that automation footprint or increasing their own resource skills. So here's a list of some of the investments certain vendors have made. This is not exhaustive in any way, of acquisitions and offerings and capabilities. As you can see, I won't read through the details, but when we're talking about expanding tools and automation capabilities, CSC, which is now DXC Technology, invested in Raceme to help flush out greater migration automation capabilities. And then down at the bottom, Dell Services, which is now NTT Data Services, acquired two companies, Clarity and Make, back in 2012, with that focus on being able to add automation to the translating of code from older technologies to new technologies. On the flip side, companies are also investing, increasing their skill base. Both, as you can see here, Infosys and Accenture have made investments or straight out acquired smaller cloud-focused consulting organizations to really build up those capabilities at the upfront strategy development migration type approach. And then Capgemini has built out dedicated migration factories in India to explode or grow those capabilities to support those refactoring and replatforming activities. So that is the core of my presentation today. I will turn over to Vicki if there are any questions out there.
Thank you, David. You did a great job. And at this time, I do not see any questions coming in on the panel. Please feel free to share any questions you might have as we're wrapping things up. Or if you have questions at a later time, you can certainly feel free to reach out to us as well. And David, I know you had also mentioned that you had developed this presentation around many of the questions that you received on this topic, so I think you probably did a great job of covering everything since we're not having any of the questions coming in. I also wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar today as well. We certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with us.
Great, and I will, if there aren't any questions, I will make one more comment. As I mentioned early on, a lot of this work was derived out of a research project we did about a year ago. We are going to be revisiting cloud services in the coming months, later this year. So we will be revisiting to understand one particular aspect of IT service providers' cloud services operations. Probably, we haven't confirmed this yet, but probably in this migration area. So we will be revisiting this and refreshing this. So keep a lookout for new updates and new information covering this area.
Great. We certainly look forward to the upcoming research. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time again to spend with us today, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.